Thank you, Renata. We now have a time period for questions and answers that can be presented to one or several of the panelists during the session on technology pathways, so that your question can be made part of the ultimate streaming video record that we'll have of the entire conference, so that many others can benefit. Please just step up to the microphone to ask your question. You may like to introduce your name before your question.
Hi. Is this on? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Linda McDonald-Glenn. I'm with the Alden March Bioethics Institute, and I'm particularly interested in the ethical, legal, social implications of all these technologies. My question, first of all, I enjoyed all the presentations very much, very educational, very informative, particularly Dr. Selmer's article. I'm very much looking forward to reading your article about the ethics of creating robots. But my question relates to quantum level effects. Tad, you had mentioned that with microscopic robots that you didn't think that quantum effects were significant, or but then from what Ralph was describing, it sounded like they might be. So I'd be very interested in hearing both of your takes on that. Is that a concern that we will have to worry about? Is that something we'll have to worry about? And if so, what are the possible implications?
Okay, so one of the simple ways of looking at it is when you are looking at molecular scale objects to realize that the electrons fuzz around. And if you want to describe the cloud of electrons, then you need to use quantum mechanical calculations to say this is the distribution of electrons in the molecule. On the other hand, the nucleus is much more massive. And for most purposes in chemistry, there are a few exceptions, but for almost all purposes in chemistry, you can use what's called the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, which says nuclei are massive. And as a consequence of being massive, the quantum fuzz is very small for the nucleus as compared with the quantum fuzz around the electron. As a consequence, we can approximate the nuclei as point masses, and the electron cloud then mediates the forces between those nuclei. So if you talk about molecular mechanics, which is a field of study, they say the point masses are nuclei. They are subject to forces exerted by the electron cloud. And the electron cloud, the forces are, or can be thought of as very Newtonian forces between the nuclei. So to that extent, molecular mechanics says we will look at the forces between nuclei. We will treat those forces as Newtonian forces, although the forces themselves are derived from a quantum analysis of the cloud of electrons. So that's a 60-second introduction to the field of molecular mechanics, and if you type molecular mechanics to Google, you can get a lot more information on that subject. That's sort of the basic way of thinking about it that is both accurate and conceptually relatively simple.
Thanks, Ralph. Next question?
Let me just...
Sorry, Tad.
Can I just follow up with a quick question? So isn't it an issue in quantum physics about unpredictability? And what you're saying is in molecular... So let me ask it this way. Are you saying that in molecular mechanics is primarily Newtonian physics that apply, and that the uncertainty of quantum level effects is not really a factor?
If you're talking about molecular mechanics, then what you can do is you can say, well, the electron cloud is allowed to settle into its ground state. And if it's in the ground state, then the forces between the nuclei are, in fact, well approximated by Newtonian mechanics. And you can use that picture of how the electrons are behaving to get a very accurate picture. Now, I should warn you that electronic devices, which talk about excited states of electrons, have to be dealt with much more in direct terms about what are the electrons doing, what are the tunneling effects of the electron, and so forth and so on. But if you're looking at how do the atoms move, most of the time, not all, but most of the time, you can think about it in this much simpler framework than the framework that is required for asking what is going on with the excited states of the electrons and what is the electronic structure doing.
Tad, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, so let me just follow up. You saw in Ralph's presentation the size of the tools he's talking about compared to how much bigger a cell was. And so the kinds of, when you're thinking about applications of the robots that are roughly the size of cells, they're so much bigger than the atoms or the nuclei and so on that just quantum effects are even less important than what Ralph described. Instead, you might worry about thermal effects. So those will push the things around in some unpredictable way, but that's just completely classical physics.
Okay, great. Next question, please.
Actually, it relates right to this question. I'm Jim Leary from Purdue University, and I design nanomedical devices which take advantage of quantum mechanical effects for actually both signal enhancement, transducement, and so on. But as a device, just like a semiconductor device, which is full of all these quantum mechanical effects, the device itself performs very predictably. So I think what you need to know is that when you make nanostructures on the order of 5 to about 30 nanometers, they very much have quantum mechanical effects, but they're very predictable. And the other thing that's interesting about that is partly those quantum mechanical effects, that this is different than ordinary chemistry. So the fact that they have surface properties that are governed by quantum mechanics, but they also change the chemical properties, so there's huge differences in toxicity. Interestingly enough, the nano structures, material structures, are usually far less toxic than the chemical elemental forms. The problem is what happens when they disintegrate, and that's an issue that we've spent quite a bit of time working on that. But I don't think you have to worry about unpredictability. That's quantum mechanics is one of the most predictable of all theories of the 20th century, despite its name. So.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. Chris?
Yeah, Chris Phoenix, co-founder, Center for Responsible Nanotechnology. I have a question for Dr. Bringshord. I heard some underlying assumptions in your talk. One was that that it was a feasible goal to make robots that responded ethically. And you asserted quite strongly that a necessary condition was logic, but I didn't see where that was a sufficient condition. In particular, with incomplete or unreliable sensor input, if the robot doesn't have a complete picture of reality, which it can't, then how is it going to make decisions that are provably ethical based on information that is obviously incomplete?
Yes, good question. Logic is the science of reasoning, not just the science of deductive reasoning. So uncertainty and its treatment in logic predates by a long shot the recent advent, say, of Bayesian approaches or neural networks, et cetera. So there are logics that handle uncertainty. In fact, the problem would be there's a smorgasbord that's probably too large, and the designer, at least at the macroscopic level, is often not sure which one to use. Their AI has unfortunately created this surfeit of logics for uncertainty. In my own case, I prefer to use strength factors rather than probabilities, because if the human in any of this technology is going to be kept in the loop, knowing what I know about how doctors actually reason, doctors do not use probabilities in any precise sense. They use strength factors. There's all kinds of empirical research that demonstrates this. I would say, secondly, although I didn't explain this, the field of ethics itself is inextricably bound up with logic, for the very simple reason that ethical principles and ethical codes and arguments about whether these are good or bad, all of that is expressed in declarative form, and argumentation and reasoning is the very bloodstream of the field. It would be logically impossible to separate logic from the activity of figuring out what's right and wrong systematically. People, of course, don't do it systematically often, but to do it systematically, you would inevitably have to make use of logic.
Okay, really quick follow-up. the robots obviously have to be competent before they can be effective at implementing ethics. Can you say something about how close we are to competent robots, at which point we'll be able to start thinking about making actual ethical robots?
Well, I don't pretend to understand even a smidgen of the feasibility, even in the longer term, of the kind of robots that we're discussing here at the size levels we're talking about. The reliability of physical manipulation in the macroscopic case is virtually non-existent. We do not have robots able to do even toddler level manipulation, despite, by the way, millions of dollars going into that. So I really don't know what to say about that. I know that theoretical possibility is clear with my Scientific American level understanding of these nanobots. But in my laboratory, having spent considerable amounts of money trying to figure out how to do manipulation of, for example, chips, as in poker chips and cards, without the robot smashing the chips and tipping them over, these are unsolved problems. And I do remember at one point Rodney Brooks, Marvin Minsky was mentioned, Rodney Brooks, sort of the guru of AI robotics, right? I remember him at a DARPA conference where he was offered an ungodly amount of money to pursue a physical manipulation task. And on the spot, he said, "There's no point in me accepting this money because I will be dead before we get a fraction of the way there, so let's do something else."
Thank you.
Barry, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. This is something I'll deal with somewhat when I speak later, but one of the questions that came up during the discussion is the very ambiguity of biology, of life. And for example, there may be some advantages to enhancing immune response prior to infection. But very often, the immune response is the cause of pathology after infection. So this is not only nuanced, it's nearly the opposite effect. And the effort to respond to a constant change in what goes on in biology is a major issue. And another major issue of ambiguity in life systems is that a very large number of genes, and it may turn out to be most genes, are polymorphic in character. That inherently means they have advantages and disadvantages. And the genome is made up of things that happened in the remote past that may have had or did have great utility then, but no longer have utility now, but may have utility in the future. So evolution deals with the past, the present, and the future. As a consequence, monkeying around with essentially any gene has obvious perils and many that are unknown. Now, we usually think of these highly deterministic genes, many of the diseases you listed. They tend to be a large number of them, but the total disease burden is small compared to common diseases like heart disease and infectious disease and so forth. And most of those genes are polymorphic. Then I had one other question, if I may. Have these toolkits, could you tell us if there's been much thinking or application to on-site fuel generation on Mars and Moon? I know there's a great interest in it.
Yeah, I don't know if the tooltips are directly applicable to that. The tooltips would be used to build something, and the something would then provide power. For example, you might be able to build better solar cells, or you might be able to build a better way of converting chemical power to electrical power that you could then use. So you could have better batteries, better storage systems. So the sort of the core focus of the tools is how do you build stuff And in particular, by narrowing the focus to how do you build a diamond, then we can start to get a grip on exactly what's going on with the specific reactions. So the tooltips, I don't envision them as having a direct role in sort of energy production or other things. I envision them as having a role in building particular structures that would then have a role in power production. And indeed, if you start looking at that, you find that you can get, if you can control structures and get every atom in the right place, you can get a dramatic improvement in the performance of whatever it is that you're dealing with. That just seems to be the case across the board, whether you're dealing with power production or computers or medical devices or whatever. So
Thanks, Ralph. We have time for one last question before our coffee break.
Yeah, I'm Chala Kumar. I'm from Center for Advanced Microstructures and Devices. I think this morning's session has been really good, including the introductory remarks by Dr. Adbilot. Pretty illuminating for me personally. Looking at all the talks that we have heard, I think the inherent among all the talks is the fact that when we somehow change parts of the body, or maybe even change the body itself, we seem to be moving into the future medicine, or where we have abundance of health and we're going to be happy. So we are making an assumption that somehow the human body is a super efficient machine. And if you tinker around repairing it or making a more super efficient machine, then we are going to have a better health. That's the assumption as I understand from these talks. So is this assumption correct? Or do we have more things to add to this assumption? Anyone can answer.
That's a great question, because Barry just pointed out, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Would each of the panelists like to have a briefly start with you, Renata, and then go down the road to that question? Then we'll take our lunch, our coffee break.
Yes, it opens up many questions. I just want to give an example of Professor Warwick, who visits our summits once in a while, who embeds computers into his body and connects his nervous system to internet, and it sounds outrageous. Nevertheless, implantation and increased cognitive powers of our wonderful but in some ways limited brain will take place one day, and on medical side it is taking place. By analogy to that, we cannot stop experimentation with that for medical reasons. There are tears to be stopped and suffering to be dealt with. There are positive or superhuman effects that maybe medical ethicists should address. I know there are plenty of great brains working on that. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Ralph?
How many people expect to be alive in 20 years? Hands. Oh my, a fair number don't expect to be alive in 20 years. How many people expect to be alive in 40 years? 40 years. How many people expect to be alive in 80 years? 80 years. Then we get into these interesting questions of what about technology and life? How about 100 years? How many people expect to be alive in 100 years? I'll go for that, but that's... Okay, so in essence, what we have in the current situation, I would regard as something which is unsatisfactory. People grow old and they die, and the people in this room grow old, and most of you are expecting to grow old and die, and I would argue that this is an undesirable state of affairs, and that we might be able to do something about this by keeping people healthy for much longer periods of time. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, yes, once we have this wonderful capability, we can engage in enhancements and improvements and all kinds of other stuff. Right now, I'd be real happy if I could be as healthy as I was, say, when I was 20. That would be good. I would be happy with that. And by and large, I think the ability to stay alive and healthy is something which is broadly desired by a whole bunch of folk. And I think as we move towards that objective, a lot of people are going to be supportive. And then as we talk about doing more and getting more capabilities, then we can have time to talk about that, and we'll see exactly where that goes in the future. Certainly I'm supportive generically, and then exactly how we proceed, there's going to be a lot of discussion. I can see a lot of room for talking about the specifics of this whole thing. But I would like to see, first, to get a fairly wide acceptance that, yeah, we could be healthy for a longer period of time, which I think would be a good thing.
Thanks, Ralph. Tad?
Thank you. It was a really good question. You know, a lot of times, I think people confuse with what we're used to with somehow the status quo, or the healthy, what we're considered healthy today is what we should aim for, and doing anything more, well, somehow we're not used to it, or it's unnatural, and therefore, in some sense, bad. And one way I like to help people approach that is just to think of, well, what things have we done in the past that are now accepted as quite common, which are also in some ways enhancements or changes. And a simple example is vaccination. So we now accept that we've somehow changed our bodies by routinely vaccination as children. That's a good thing. Generally has taken care of a lot of childhood diseases. It's not perfect. I mean, there are some reactions against vaccinations and so on, but overall as being a good thing, that it's not much of an ethical debate about anymore once we see it happen. And I would expect a lot of these other kinds of things that people are now talking about for future technologies, if people choose them freely, if it's a wider range of options for people who are healthier and enjoying their lives better, that those also will not be controversial after the fact.
To the question, the body is indeed a machine. The mind is not, and I've written about that position. And secondly, in terms of life extension and immortality, for anyone trained in philosophy, that's always an interesting question, because arguably the majority of philosophers through time who pondered that, the question of survival of a long period of time would find it to be an odd question, since most of them were sure they were going to live forever to begin with. So that's it. Thank you.
All righty. Well, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much. It's now 10:40, and I'd like to ask everyone to limit the coffee break to 10 minutes and to come back at 10:50 when we'll pick right back up. Thank you.